I hope that that's been a meaningful just beginning for us all as we kind of reflect and allow God and his Holy Spirit to be alive and in our spirit now as we listen and become part of this, the rest of this event. I want to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Jen and I used to go to a church in Belfast called City Church, and I think it was probably 15 odd years ago that Roy Searle was visiting, and he was the speaker, and I had heard about him and I thought this would be good, but he really blew me away with one of the best sermons I think I've ever heard, just because sometimes you hear a sermon and it hits you right where you need to be, you need to hear. And he spoke that day about the times we're living in and looking to the future, but he also talked about our history. Roy helped to found with others the Northumbria community, which in that community has produced a resource called the Celtic Daily Prayer. Roy lectures, he's led churches, he's a missional thinker and a pioneer. He's many things. And he's someone that I think has got words that we could really listen to as YWAM. And I'm really excited to hear what he's got to say. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Roy Searle, who I presume you're in the northeast of England somewhere.
I am indeed.
Part of England that St. Aidan was very familiar with. And so I'm going to hand over to you, Roy.
Thank you, folks. Well, in the words of St. Francis as he greeted St. Dominic on the road to Umbria, hi, it's good to be with you. And I bring you greetings from Northumbria, which was once known as a cradle, not the, but a cradle of Christianity. Yeah, it's good to be with you. It's actually about 25 years, I think, since we first met each other, Johnny. And I was middle-aged then, and now I'm old. But it's a great honor and privilege and a joy to be with you today. And I'm going to share my talk in two sections, one of which you might find quite depressing, but hang on in there because after the coffee break comes some hope. I hope you can see on the screen there some words, the lines of the American lyricist and songwriter Bob Dylan. And he penned those in the 1960s, but my goodness, in 2021, we can truly say the times they are truly changing. A couple more quotes from the amazing Brené Brown. We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized greed, inequality, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature. I don't normally quote Frankie Boyle, but I think he has some tremendous things to say. There's no normal for us to go back to. People sleeping in the streets wasn't normal. Children living in poverty wasn't normal. Neither was our taxes helping to bomb the people of Yemen. Using other people's lives to pile up objects wasn't normal. The whole thing was absurd. Surely it's time to start imagining something better. The moral essayist James Baldwin wrote these words: not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. That's quite a strong word for the nations, but indeed it's a very strong word for our churches and Christian communities at this time. I teach a lot on and do a fair bit of mentoring on the issue of leadership. And I guess this is my favorite definition of leadership from the writer Max Dupre. The first responsibility of as a leader is to define reality. The last is to say thank you. And in between, the leader is a servant. And we need to be men and women, if we are followers of Jesus Christ, to be real about what's happening both in the church and in the world. And I just want us to take a few moments just to kind of survey a little about what's happening in the world of which we are all a part. this remarkable image by the Cambridge artist Issam Koubaj, Dark Water, Burning World. We are living through times where we are seeing the shaking of the world. COVID has disrupted, and goodness me, we don't need to be reminded about the world that is burning up and the famines and floods and catastrophes that many people are experiencing in our world today. I read yesterday David Putnam, who actually lives in Ireland. He spoke at the Shirley Williams lecture the other day, and basically it was his resignation speech. And if you have an opportunity, I would encourage you to look on David Putnam's site and read what is the most amazing lecture that he gave. It's lengthy, it's over 4,000 words. He took 25 minutes to deliver it. It won't take you that long to read it. But some amazing things that he looked across what was happening, particularly in the United Kingdom. But I think these are things that are pertinent for us across the world, and particularly where most of you are in Europe. The rise of popularism and the emergence of extremist groups, the threat of terrorism on a global scale, the challenge of the refugee crisis, global warming, and social media. He said something incredibly challenging about social media in the light of allegations and information that was given by a whistleblower within Facebook, when he was talking about, but none of the folks who own these things and who are the shareholders of social media platforms like Facebook have the bottle to pull back on the productivity and the profits that they're making on the back of how these things work. And he said, this is capitalism quite literally eating its young, messing with people's lives. He goes on to talk about fake news and propaganda. I listened to a lecture yesterday at the Berwick Literary Festival, Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is not far from me, by a guy called Peter Oborne, who talks now about how in politics, fake news has become just the norm. Propaganda, the lessons that were not learned, or rather the principles that were applied by people like Goebbels in 1930s Germany, being used again, not only in Russia, but in parts of Britain. The lies that politicians are allowed to get away with, which, 20 years ago, they would have been forced to resign, but the dispatch boxes, prime minister's questions, other cabinet things, lies that are told as truth. And Putnam, of course, lays heavily into the Brexit lies. The erosion of democracy within the Western world, the tightening of police measures, the data that we all sign up to when we just click on those things when it says, have you read the terms and conditions? But of course, very few of us do. Data in wrong hands. These are our worrying trends for a culture that is changing. Simone Weil talked about this, about living in a rootless society. To be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. It's one of the hardest to find. A human being has roots by virtue of his real, active and natural participation in the life of a community, which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past and certain particular expectations of the future. I work quite closely with a very good friend. One of my cell friends is a psychotherapist. And if you're involved in psychology or psychiatry or psychotherapy, you'll know that one of the big issues facing people in the psychiatrist chair or the counseling session is that of identity and a sense of belonging, which in large measure is related to this sense of rootlessness which people face. Defining reality reminds us that we live in the West, in Europe, in an emerging post-Christendom culture. The erosion, the evaporating of the Judeo-Christian foundations that were laid by our Celtic forefathers and mothers in the faith. The end times, as some people have described it, of Western culture as we know it. The shift from a Christian paradigm to a postmodern, post-Christendom society is upon us. Those narratives that shaped European culture for centuries is now simply one societal story among many. The values that shaped Western culture, values that were rooted in the Christian tradition, now find themselves competing in a marketplace of conflicting and fragmented ideologies. And the dominance of secular humanism, Western capitalist consumerism, and you put that together with individualism, has contributed to the demise of the notion of community and society. And the reality for the church in the West, despite the rhetoric, despite the talk in some quarters of revival, actually, I would suggest, feels more like survival or that of exile. We're moving into uncharted territory. We're moving into a world era we have not seen before. Of course, we can learn from history, and various people throughout generations have had to, go these ways before and explore new territories. Every century, if you look at the history of centuries over the last 2,000 years, you'll see that there's been something that has shaken and changed the world. People will look back on the 20th century and will speak about the two world wars. People, I believe, will look back on the 21st century and talk about the pandemic era. But of course, any understanding of pandemics, we realize that one pandemic is not over. We're likely to be living with pandemics for 3, 4, 5 or more years yet. COVID has not gone away. And in the midst of that, we are called to both learn and unlearn and relearn. I'm just reading a fascinating book by a guy called Adam Grant called Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. And, the arrogance with which the West has kind of addressed issues of COVID and the pandemic has been absolutely appalling to observe. And we've had to unlearn things that we've assumed we could just get a hold of and control. And classically, one of these examples, there's a book written by a Lake District farmer called Pastoral Song. And one of the things that the farming community is reluctantly coming to terms with is that actually ploughing, which has been the mainstay of arable farming, ploughing is now deemed to be ecologically disastrous. And Rebank says, this news is staggering and hard to take in for us farmers. Our civilization rests on the plow and the chemical tools of the post-war period, and yet the plow is the problem. And that means changing how we farm and thinking again about the tools we have come to rely on. I think that has huge implications when we think about the church. Always doing the way we've done things, or at least in our Protestant circles, the way in which things were constructed after the period of the Reformation. Another writer who in the 1960s observed peregrine falcon, a pair of peregrines, falcon in East Anglia, said the hardest thing of all to see this is what really is there. And sometimes I did quite a bit of work, consultancy work, advising churches and leadership teams, is simply holding up a mirror to the church as to what is obvious to an outsider, but is not obvious to those of us who are caught up in the mechanisms and institution of church. I'm no particular fan of kind of dystopian apocalyptic scenarios that are caused by some global catastrophe, the premise of which behind such thinking is faced with a disaster. Things will only get worse. Civilization will collapse, society will unravel, communities will disintegrate, and we'll be back to the law of the jungle, everybody for themselves. I think that flies in the face, actually, of the nature of the God whom we have come to know and to love and to serve. It was John F. Kennedy back in the early 60s who, in relation to China, observed this. When written in Chinese, the word crisis composed of two characters, one representing danger and the other representing opportunity. And I think that we have an opportunity in the midst of the terrible crisis and shaking that's going on in the world to actually think about some of the opportunities, have a rethink, to recalibrate. Little example of this. I have 8 grandchildren, and I was at my one of my grandchildren's 4th birthday on Saturday in Newcastle, here in the northeast of England. And it was a little earlier this year, because we were able to bubble with that family, and my wife Shirley childminds she and her younger sister. I was able to teach Lyra how to ride a bike. And of course, there came that moment when the stabilizers were removed from her bike and she had to learn to ride unaided with the stabilizers. And I, thinking about that, I think about the church in COVID, in lockdown, that actually I think God removed the stabilizers from our churches during that period. Our stabilizers in most churches being a building in which we meet and do all the stuff that we do, and our worship gatherings. And those churches that were wholly dependent upon having a building, wholly dependent upon gathering together and doing the stuff, found themselves in kind of very difficult, uncharted waters. But some of those churches discovered actually they could be the church as opposed to simply doing church. They discovered what it was to be the church in the neighborhood, what it was to be a dispersed community, and yet gathering together, perhaps on social media and Zoom or WhatsApp groups or whatever. And now with, lockdown easing and regulations becoming more relaxed, it's been really heartening for me in my role as a pioneer ambassador with the Baptist denomination here in the UK to see those churches that have not gone back to normal, but have been asking the questions, what does it mean to be the church in a changing world? I don't know if any of you remember the Mr. Men series. I enjoyed reading this to my kids. And here was Mr. Topsy-Turvy. Topsy-turvy is actually a medieval term. It means to turn over or to topple over. And it was flipping the topsoil over and digging it deeper beneath the earth so that it could nourish and replenish the ground underneath. I think it's a lovely image of the possibilities of what might be going on in God's purposes today. We could get quite depressed, and certainly the levels of anger and anxiety are through the roof in relation to people's psyche, in particularly Western society today. Of course, we're having to contend with things that we've not been able to control. We felt for the first time powerless by the implications of the pandemic, of COVID, not only the disease, but the consequences. And yet for brothers and sisters and for people across the other parts of the world, they have lived with such situations of powerlessness. They have lived with uncertainty and vulnerability. And I remember having a conversation with somebody who'd just come back from Aleppo in Syria, and the concern expressed by a pastor in Aleppo for the well-being of people in Britain living with such uncertainty, with such suffering. We could learn a lot from our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world about the folly of our believing that we can control all things. There is another narrative, another story, and it is one of hope. We have the opportunity, I believe, during this present and emerging dark age to discover new and life-giving ways, to discover God's loving purposes, God's good purposes for the world today that speaks hope in the midst of the shaking of the nations. That the nonsense of trying to live without God, to live in denial or contravention of his ways, is to reap what we've sown. Conflict and war, inequality and injustice, the world burning with its fires and floods and famines, racism, white supremacy, sexism, misogyny, women walking with fear on our streets, domestic violence, abuse, could go on and on. The need for food banks, calling things benefits. And what we're talking about is providing basic necessities for people to live on. The ugly and evil disparity between wealth and poverty. In our own UK, cutting foreign aid, refusing to welcome the stranger, those fleeing from war-torn lands. where we are not innocent bystanders. The hideous amount of money that we raise through the sale of arms, weapons of warfare. You could look at the rise in anxiety, the strains on the public services, rising hate crime across Europe generally, and the partisan attitudes that fuel division and conflict and foster resentment and a loss of respect for anybody who doesn't have the same view that we hold. It's a serious omission, our inability to debate, to discuss, and to discern with others, to talk with people whom we disagree with, who have different outlooks and perspectives. And then we've got the medical professions and schools and colleges and social services, the voluntary sector. They're all on their knees here in the UK, not praying, but exhausted and overwhelmed. And as for the developing nations, the earth's poor, an abandonment on the altar of the wealthiest nations, self and national interest. These are not the signs of God's kingdom. There is another story. Read Ephesians 1-6, another good news story that reminds us of God's loving purposes for the world to bring all things under Christ, under his rule. It's a story of hope and transformation, of redemption, a narrative that can shape the world for good. Now, it's been tough these last couple of years. We look around us, we become painfully aware that we're a frail and wearied humanity, wearied from the countless struggles and threats brought about by COVID and the havoc it's wreaked all over the world, weary from wrestling with unresolved racial tensions and hatred, sick of arguing with opposing ideas on how to care for ourselves and others. If I had a pound or a euro for every church leader who had said to me, how do you cope with all the different expectations, demands, strong opinions of people with our churches, fellowships, and congregations? We need God. We need God. And we need God in this time of shaking. We need to walk humbly, to act justly, to love mercy, so that we can regain once more what it is to live generously and passionately, loving God and neighbor. I believe that in the shaking that has and is taking place, it's a call for us to seek God, to lament, and to worship God, which is not just about gathering. I'm sitting in my new upper room, garden room, in a house that we bought that was built in 1783. It's needed major renovation and building work. So we had lots of tradesmen here. And our builder said the other day, he's not a Christian, and he just said, I just don't get it. Where's the church been in COVID? And I'm saying, well, the church has been doing lots of things locally. But he says, yeah, but you see, what comes across to me, Roy, is that the church is just concerned to getting back and doing what it wants to do. There's so much need in society, and yet it seems that, all the conversation in churches that I hear is about how can we get back, when can we get back, when will we be able to do this, when will we be able to do that. I was able to challenge some of his assumptions. I also felt charged by some of them as well. Our task is not to mirror the attitudes of the world, self-interest, our own interest, but to realize the power of God, the goodness of God and his good news to redeem, to transform, to change the world, so that out of the crisis that the world is facing, we might see new opportunities. And we, as the people of God, disciples of Jesus, can contribute something. COVID has brought the very worst out of society, but it's also brought the best out of some people. Solidarity, just when, I'll be political for a moment, just when Britain is going its own way, it's going to be great, but we'll never be Great Britain again. And we'll never be great unless we walk humbly before God and live generously, and as we're blessed, bring blessing to others. But actually the idea of self-interest, national interest, being kind of so concerned for ourselves without any concern for others, is in stark denial of the solidarity that the world needs in order to face the issues that we face. God's great care for the needy comes through the agency of people like you and I, who express something of the love of God, hearts that reflect the nature of God, and hands that express his loving purposes and compassion for the world. Let me end, before we have a little break, with these words from Teresa of Avila. Christ has no body but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks with compassion on his world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes. You are his body. We stand as a world, and certainly in Europe, and indeed on European Day, there was launched, wasn't there, a commission on the future of Europe by the European Parliament. And I think Europe particularly, but the world generally, we're at a crossroads. We stand at the crossroads. This is a critical period. And after this short break, I want to share with you some of the inspiration and wisdom, the positivity and experience of the Celtic saints who lived at a time in history that saw the world changing. And with the advent of dark ages, God raised up a movement that brought light and hope to the world and shaped European society and the wider world for good. But that's a trailer for what I'm going to share next, which is full of hope and a call and an invitation for us to engage in God's loving purposes. So we're going to have a short break now. Johnny, I'll leave you to decree how long that break is.
Thank you. Thanks, Roy, so much. We're just going to take a short break. I think Mike is going to put a 5-minute counter up. So 5 minutes, everyone. You can go and hopefully your kettle is modern enough to boil water in 5 minutes and get yourself a cup of tea or whatever you'd like. And let's be back sharp 5 minutes. Thanks so much, Roy. Looking forward to the second half.